And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Randall Carlson, master builder and renegade scholar who explored the interface between ancient mysteries and modern science for over 4.5 decades. He's been an active Freemason for 45 years and has led over 50 tours exploring sites of antiquity and geological catastrophism. Today we're going to discuss his research into earth changes, catastrophic events, and more. Randall, thank you for joining me and welcome.
Well, my pleasure to join you, Jeff.
Randall, before we get started, a hot topic right now is the controversy of what went down on the Joe Rogan program about plasma energy. Would you like to make any comment on that before we have you disclose some catastrophism?
Sure, I'll say a few words about that. I've just this new interview that I did with Danny Jones, formerly the Danny Jones podcast, formerly Concrete with a K. I kind of went into pretty much detail on that, and I'm going to be going into that on more. But essentially what went down was this. About 8 years ago, I started having a conversation with an inventor, scientist, a geochemist, who was living on an island in the Indian Ocean, who had been through the meat grinder with one of the major oil companies. And he was an oil prospector, which was kind of a natural thing for somebody with a geochemical background. He had discovered an oil reservoir, an oil deposit, and he had obtained the drilling rights from the government of the country that it was in. And there was one of the major oil companies that had overstated their reserves by 30% and had found themselves kind of in a pickle and thought that this oil reservoir was promising enough that if they could obtain the license to drill, it might solve their problem. And so they went on a campaign to discredit Malcolm the inventor and paint him as a nut job to try to scare away investors. So they bribed politicians, they bribed journalists and so forth to create this smear campaign against him. So what happened to him was kind of a precursor to what's happened to a lot of people in the last year or two. If you look at what's going on with Russell Brand right now, here you've got accusations by anonymous sources with no evidence other than hearsay, yet he's being branded as if he's already guilty. Look what happened to Graham Hancock in the aftermath of Ancient Apocalypse. And I spent some time, Jeff, going through the attacks on him. And what the thing that became abundantly clear to me was the fact that they're all reading from the same script. Because, if you took what they were saying at face value, you come away, well, Graham Hancock is a conspiracy nut. He's a white supremacist. He's a racist. Never mind that he's married to a woman of color and his children are of mixed race. He's still a racist, right? But if you took that at face value, yeah, now you're going to believe that that's what he is. And then look what, wherever you come down as far as what Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think he makes very valid points about the vaccines, the efficacy of those and everything. But yet the way he's being smeared in the media, and what happened to Joe Rogan himself in the aftermath of him having some alternate points of view on there about the pandemic and all of that, with, people like Neil Young and Joni Mitchell and stuff. Oh, we're not going to, we're going to pull our music from Spotify if they have Joe Rogan on there. But so the surprising thing to me is that with all of this that we've seen going on and how media manipulates, that so many people were willing to just buy into this stuff. Well, so basically it was last November, almost a year ago. I was on the Joe Rogan show with Graham Hancock, and we were talking ancient civilizations, and the subject of ancient technology came up, which Joe is very interested in. And Graham knew that I had been talking to this inventor that had developed a system of technology based upon plasma energy. Now, at the time, I'm still, I kind of look at myself as far as the technology is concerned and understanding the science behind it. I may be in second grade now. I was still in kindergarten back then. So I'm just learning about it. Um, so I was hesitant to even talk about it because I like to vet things myself. I like to know what I'm talking about. But I went and I made some statements about the inventor, Malcolm, and his situation. And Joe then asked me afterwards if I would come back and talk about that. And I said, sure, to the extent that I'm capable and to the extent that I understand it, I'd be happy to. Well, in the interim, Malcolm came to the United States um, for a number of reasons, but one of the outcomes of that was I had the opportunity to get coached firsthand in the technology and in the science and how it works. Now, up to this point, I've had several conversations with people that have known him, including Roland Perry, who is probably Australia's top selling author, who is also an investigative reporter. And he had spent 4 years investigating Malcolm and the technology and and in the process became friends with him and concluded that, all of this early stuff was primarily all BS. Um, as a matter of fact, one of the things that came down, they got caught. And in 2003, the entire board of this oil company actually resigned. And it was as a result, at least partially, if not completely, because of this scandal that they caught in bribing people to try to ultimately gain control of the drilling rights. So what was a little surprising to me, though, is the number of people who just completely bought into it without any critical thought or investigation on their own. And even if any of this was true, and some elements, maybe have been true to some extent, only to the effect that what they do, just like with any of the, whether it's Graham or Russell Brand or Robert F. Kennedy, you look at, some of the stuff that they're using is based on fact. But what they do, this is how propaganda works. You got to have some element of truth in it in order to give it viability, in order to get people to buy into it and believe it, right? Now they can totally exaggerate, they can bring in, everything, including the kitchen sink. But as long as there's some element in there, that's how effective propaganda works. Okay, so the result was in February, I went back on Rogan and Malcolm was here and George Howard, the founder of the Cosmic Tusk website, who also organized the Cosmic Summit that we had a few months ago, which was an incredible experience, and several other people. We took the drive over to Austin and I checked with Joe and I said, look, if you want to talk about the science, I got the guy right here. I mean, I could invite him on because he's going to be able to talk more effectively about the science than I am. And what do you think about that? And he said, sure, bring him on. Okay, so in the interim, Jamie, Joe's producer and tech man there, he goes online to do some background and finds this 15 or 20-year-old stuff and prints out a bunch of it. When we walked in and sat down, Joe was looking at it and basically didn't know what to make of it. The upshot of it was that instead of talking about the science of plasma physics, which is what I totally wanted to do, we got off into all of the scandal, the politics, the conspiracy theories. And during the whole episode, I'm trying to steer it back to, let's talk about the science. Let's talk about the science. Anyhow, it got contentious. And Malcolm, he's been up against a lot of obstacles. And so he's, when he gets attacked, he fights back. And which I can't blame him for. Absolutely can't blame him for, just like I couldn't blame Graham if he fights back, or Russell Brand if he fights back against accusations. So anyhow, at the end of it, I'm like, oh God, this did not go down like I was hoping it would. And I'm thinking, okay, so if the upshot of this comes out that this guy is a grifter, that this technology is all fake, well, now my name's going to be tied into that, and my credibility is going to take a hit. And some people have said online, "Oh, Randall's lost his credibility," But here's the thing. So then once it was over, Joe comes up, kind of catches me on the side as we're leaving, and he says, "Would it be okay with you if I didn't air this right away, if I vetted it?" And I said, "Absolutely. Don't. It'd be better not to air it, because all it's going to do is just fuel the conspiracy theories, fuel the toxic conversations and arguments back and forth, and be a huge distraction from the science of plasma physics itself. We don't want to go into all of this stuff that happened 15 or 20 years ago in a deliberate effort to undermine this guy's credibility. So fine, don't air it. But I will come back, just me, and in fact, Joe even suggested, would you be willing to come back, just you?" And I said, yes. My thought, though, is give me some time, because I knew two things. One is that I'm studying pretty deep into trying to understand plasma physics, and I only had a smattering of knowledge before all of this went down. But over the last few years, I began to realize, hey, there is really something here. This is a viable energy solution. I want to know more about it. So I've been studying it, and I thought, okay, the longer interim of time between now, which was last February, and going back on, the more solid is going to be my understanding of the science. Secondly, I also knew that there was some major testing in the pipeline that was going to happen, starting particularly in the early summer, and it did. So now there has been a major industrial application that is being tested right now on a substation outside of London, and I've shown some slides and stuff on Danny Jones' podcast. The machine that utilizes the plasma is called a thunderstorm generator, because the principles upon which it works are pretty much precisely the principles by which a thunderstorm is created, by two opposing forces, primarily a temperature differential. And thunderstorms produce lightning, which is plasma lightning. And there's some very interesting ideas about that. There is actually a plasma thread that precedes the exchange of electricity, that the plasma thread connects the cloud layer with the earth, and then the electricity follows the plasma thread between the earth and the cloud layer. Anyways, so the principle of the machine is based upon observations of nature, not unlike how Victor Schauberger came up with technologies based upon his very astute observations of natural processes. So the core of this technology is called the thunderstorm generator. It's based upon the operation is based on the principle of the rank Hilch vortex tube, which is used throughout the industry. It's used to cool nuclear reactors. It's used in the air conditioning industry, many other applications. And really, there's no consensus among scientists how the thing actually works. Well, okay, so I knew that coming up that they were already building the components in a machine shop. And there are now videos online. Anybody can go and look at it and see the process as the machinery is being built. You can see the technology being delivered to the site. You can see it being retrofitted. It was a 400 kilowatt Perkins generator at this substation. And of course, the engineers and the managers of this substation are not going to let some whack job come in and retrofit one of their big generators unless they had seen enough to become convinced that there was viability to this technology. So they okayed it. They came in, they brought in, Malcolm brought in a group of people. They built this equipment in the shop. There's videos of it online that anybody can go see. They brought it to the site. They retrofitted the generator. They activated it, and it worked exactly as predicted. I would particularly encourage people to watch an interview with one of the scientists there who did the annealing of the components, who says right out, I was totally skeptical, but I've seen it for myself, and I'm not sure. We're going to have a few years ahead of us figuring out how this works, right? So there was that. Then was the Tesla Tech convention last month in Albuquerque. So Malcolm and George Howard and several other people went there. What they did was they got two generators. I think they were Honda generators. They got the first one. The generator was defective, so they had to go last minute get another one. They videotaped and live streamed the retrofit of the generator right there on stage, and then they had probably, I wasn't there for this, but they had at least 6 or 8 independent people there, scientists, engineers, technicians, people who'd worked with Tesla technology and that kind of thing, independently evaluating the outcome. People who brought their own gas analyzers, one top level scientist who actually works, I don't think I'm supposed to say where he works, but he brought a mass spectrometer. So they had like, 3 or 4 gas analyzers testing the effluents coming out of the exhausts of these generators. They had a mass spectrometer, and they all concurred in the same thing, as that the carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, the nitrous oxide, and other methanes went down and nearly zeroed out, while oxygen went from around 4 or 5% up to 19 to 21%, which is the optimum oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, all of this has been independently verified by people who came there actually skeptical of what they were going to see. Now, there is, until the report comes out, I can't disclose where or what laboratory it has been in the last month. But I was there, witnessed. I was there with probably 10 or 11 other individuals from industry, from science, people who had backgrounds in engineers, brought their own testing equipment, set up 2 generators, a control generator without the technology, another generator with the technology. And so I was there, was able to see for myself and see what everybody else saw. All of this has been recorded now, by the way, so it's documented. And anybody, and now the firm that did the testing is writing up a report, and I believe that once that report comes out, it's going to be made public, and at that point, I'll be able to talk freely about the whole thing. But the point is that it was there, the people that were there, highly trained individuals, fully capable of evaluating the efficacy and the validity of this technology. Okay, so I was there in this group, saw it myself, saw what would happen when the generator is, when the technology is turned on. You've got the readouts right there. You can watch the analyzers, the gas analyzers. You can, within a minute of turning it on, you begin to see the changes occurring. This has all been well documented, thoroughly documented. And I can say this: one of the people that made a comment about, in the wake of the Danny Jones show, was that well, this technology or whatever has been well understood. Well, for years, and there's nothing new here, something to that effect. And I would say components, pieces of this, yes, have been understood for years, going back to Nikola Tesla, coming down through Stanley Myers and Martin Fleischmann and Victor Schauberger. And there's a whole list of inventors and scientists that have explored different aspects of this technology. The difference here is that, and Malcolm is the first to admit that he received inspiration and knowledge from all of these predecessors that went before him, right? His different approach, though, was to open source everything. Now, put it out there so that it can never be bottled up or suppressed again. So I was assisted in that process. That was partly what I got recruited for, was to help basically just get the notes, the schematics, the licensing, and some of the patent applications out for people to see. And there are now a growing group of independent researchers who are now beginning to test the technology. And it has multiple applications. Like I said, the thing that happened at the substation in London was industrial level. But there is a video online. If you go to HowTube, you'll be able to find howtube.com. You'll be able to find all of the links and everything. You can go to a video where Roland Perry, the Australian author, investigative reporter, is there with a couple of mechanics who've just done a retrofit of an internal combustion engine. And they're testing it there in their shop. This was like 2 years ago. It worked, right? Now, here's the thing. It's a new science, but it's a very old science, I believe. I believe it's a recovery of something that people knew once upon a time, a long time ago, that got lost for various reasons, and various elements of that have been rediscovered throughout the last century or more. And now we have a small group of people who are coming around like, and here was the thing. One of my takeaways from participating for this weekend at this testing facility in this laboratory was that all of the people involved are looking at it and coming up with a variety of explanations. Okay, we're seeing this. We're seeing the increase in oxygen. We're seeing the decrease in carbon monoxide. We see this extraordinary temperature differential using thermal analyzers in the equipment that makes no sense, but it's here. We're testing it. It's verified over and over again. And what I took away from it is basically we're trying to understand what we're seeing and how this works. And so people who believe that, oh, this is, it's something that's been that there's nothing new here. No, this is something quantitatively and qualitatively different. And the thing that I have seen over and over now I have personally interacted, if I've not in person or online, had conversations with probably 24 highly qualified people now who have, in one respect or another, have been looking at this. And they're all coming up and discussing and debating what's going on here. What are we seeing? How does this work? So like George Lush in his interview really kind of captures, he says, I was a skeptic, yet I'm sitting here with my thermal analyzer going over and over and over again, not believing what I'm seeing, but I kept doing it until I finally said, okay, this is real. Now the task before us is really figuring out exactly what is going on here, because this plasma physics is a new thing. And people don't want to, they seem to think that, well, everything is cut and dried. There's some experts that have already figured this out. And, this is kind of it's the same, similar with climate change. Well, we don't need to look at anything for ourselves because the experts have it all figured out and there's a consensus, blah, blah, blah. Well, BS. We're just at the very beginning of figuring out the climate and weather of this planet and how it works and what are the variables involved. It's the same thing with this plasma physics. But I can tell you this now, there's some major industrial players and governments that are very interested. There was representatives of the Indian government that I met at this testing weekend as a result of the Tesla Tech conference. A lot of people now are looking at it. There's sort of like a group of backyard inventors that are coming together to say, how can we apply this technology, say, on a like garage mechanic level? And you can. And that's going to be happening in the next 6 months to a year. And let's see, Alchemical Science, Jordan, I don't remember his last name. We've been communicating with each other. He's in Australia. He's been exploring this and has some really interesting videos up that he's putting up online. I think they're going to be also linked from HowTube. So the bottom line is that yes, this is a new science, but from what I've seen in my study of ancient civilizations and my reading of things like the Vedas and other sources, I had become convinced a long time ago that ancient cultures were much more scientifically and technologically advanced than they've been given credit for. However, how did that knowledge actually manifest? Well, I think we've got a major clue here, and we won't have time to get into this today, Jeff, We can always do a follow-up conversation if you want. And like I say, I may be at the second grade level now. I'm definitely not at a graduate student level with this. However, nobody is really. Even Malcolm the inventor says there are things here that are mysterious to me, and I don't really fully understand. He'll admit that. He'll admit that. But it works. That's the thing. It works. And this is the thing that frustrated me about what went down with the Rogan podcast, is that so much focus got on the conspiracies and the scandals and this and that. But like my friend Ben Van Kerkwick, who does Uncharted X, made the point, a lot of the people, even Nikola Tesla, if he was alive today, you would be able to make a very convincing case that the guy's a nut job, right? He was an eccentric, and he could be acerbic, he could be difficult to deal with. And if somebody wanted to try to discredit Tesla technology, how do you do that? Well, the technology was real, but what you do is you go after the man, you go after the person. And that's what went down here. And the frustrating thing to me is, but I think that this is being overcome now, because enough people are going, wait a second, whatever the background is to the inventor, and the stuff that's been put out in the media and online is about 98% bullshit. But whatever that is, that's one thing. The question we should be focusing on is the technology real? Does it work? Does it live up to expectations? What is the science behind it? And what frustrated me, Jeff, was how, because of the what went down in the aftermath of the Joe Rogan, was that's all the conversation. Now, all of this time, there are hundreds of pages of notes. You know, that all that stuff was given to me. I passed it over to HowTube. It's been put up online. I think we're coming back to that now. I think the Tesla tech was a big component of that. You know, getting the conversation back. Hopefully, the interview I did with Danny Jones is going to help get that conversation back. When these reports come out from this most recent testing, I will say, as far as I haven't gotten an update on the London build out, but apparently officials from the London government, or who are in charge of the power distribution for London, are evaluating the effects and the viability of what this generator retrofit before they allow it to be fed into the power grid of London. But from what I've seen, it's likely that, the other thing I'll mention is that it also typically doubles the efficiency of any engine or generator that it's applied to. That's been another outcome of it. So there's a lot to unpack with it. And I'm in the process of doing that. So are a lot of other individuals. We're communicating with each other. We're sharing ideas and thoughts and notes. I'm a student. I say that right out, that I certainly am not a master of plasma physics, but this is the analogy I use. You don't necessarily need to know anything about the details or the processes by which thermal energy in an internal combustion engine is converted to rotary engine. You don't need to know any of that to know that a car works. You can get in this effing car and go drive it. You know that it works without necessarily understanding the technology. This is kind of where we're at with it, in a sense. And a lot of these very intelligent, very educated people, very highly credentialed people that I've met and gotten to know over the last 6 months, say, are all basically, some of them are feeling confident. I think I've got a handle on what's going on here. Others are, so there's a lot of discussion going on, a lot of debate, and out of this, I think we're gonna come to some kind of a consensus eventually. However, it's not absolutely necessary to understand every facet of what's going on with this plasma science or plasma physics to see that it works, and that you can actually retrofit an automobile with it and double its efficiency of energy use, eliminate the carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide that's coming out of the exhaust. One of the applications now that is actually being seriously looked at by at least 2 governments that I know of India is one of them, is a retrofit of your coal-fired smokestacks, because it can capture the effluents, and instead of putting out pollution, it's basically putting out air. And there's some funny video footage from the Tesla Tech conference where they had the generator running on stage, but the fumes of it were was stinking up the auditorium there where the people. Now this is all being watched by several hundred people, and it's being live streamed. It's being live streamed out to the world, to anybody can see it, right? So what they ended up having to do was move the generator out onto the loading dock, right? Because of the fumes. Well, then they turned the technology on, and within a couple of minutes, instead of exhaust gas fumes with carbon monoxide and nitrous oxide and methane and carbon dioxide, all of this stuff coming out, it's air with 20% oxygen, which is the optimum level of oxygen in pristine, unpolluted, let's say, mountain air, right? There's a funny video of George getting down, and we're saying, we can actually see George huffing plasmoids, because he's right down there smelling with his nose within inches of the exhaust pipe. And everybody standing there is seeing this, witnessing it. The mass spectrometer is showing it's putting out 20% oxygen. It's putting out 0% carbon monoxide. So, I mean, this is all being documented independently now by probably a couple of dozen different players. So the only rationale for saying, oh, this is all a big hoax, it's a con job, is intellectual laziness. Somebody just wants to spout off an opinion about something they know nothing about. Meanwhile, there's a group of people who have seen it, know that it works, will admit we don't fully understand what's going on here, but it works. And now we're going to try to understand, because this technology has tremendous potential to change the industrial landscape of the world if it's implemented on a broad scale. And again, go to HowTube or Strike Foundation, listen to the 20-minute interview with George Lush. And what's entertaining and interesting about it is this is different George than George Howard, but he's almost scratching his head saying, I'm as skeptical as they come. But I'm seeing this for myself and going, okay, this is counterintuitive. This shouldn't be happening. But I'm seeing it happen. Okay, that could be almost like something, the old saying from Arthur C. Clarke, any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic.
Mm-hmm.
And George kind of made an allusion to that. He says it's almost like magic, but there is something going on here, and it has to do with the nature of plasmas. And that's I think, going to be the key. And I think two things. Understanding this plasma physics could potentially change the industrial, like I said, and change the industrial landscape of the Earth. It could render a lot of the concerns pretty much about human-induced climate change or global warming irrelevant. And the other thing is I think, without having talked about it and necessarily going there, because I don't want the discussion to suddenly shift over into the woo-woo level, but I think there is some pretty considerable and convincing evidence that this technology has been known to human civilizations in the past and has been lost. So that's pretty much the story. I mean, there's more I could get into, but that is kind of the gist of it. And hopefully, I'm kind of delaying calling up Joe and saying, Joe, get me back on there and let's do the follow-up conversation, only because every week that goes by, I'm learning more. And I'm definitely wanting to delay until the report comes out from this industrial testing that's been going on over the last month, because that's powerful ammunition. So I haven't been in any hurry to go public with all of this, because I know that this testing has been going on, and there are some highly qualified people coming together who are taking a serious look at this. And if this thing was a fraud, it would have been exposed a long time ago. Um, so I'm not in a hurry to get back on Joe. I'm kind of thinking, I'll reach out to him and maybe propose something early next year. But like I said, every week that goes by, there's more evidence coming down proving the veracity of this, and also my own knowledge and understanding of the science is slowly but surely increasing. And so that's why I haven't been on a big hurry to get back on Joe, but I think at some point that needs to happen, because really, Joe, I don't think he knows any of what's evolved over the last 6 months since I was on his show. I think he's still in the paradigm that, oh, this is some con or anything, and he doesn't know anything about the London build out, the Tesla Tech Conference, or the latest industrial uh, testing that's been going on, and the number of highly qualified individuals that have come on board and are looking at this with a skeptical eye, but seeing that there's something very real here. I don't think he knows any of that. Now, with the buzz that I've seen generated around this interview that I did with Danny Jones, it's very possible that some of that is getting back to him. But I really do want Joe to, um, to be made aware of the fact that, yeah, there's a whole other side to this. It's not just a con job that can be thrown out and dismissed. But there's something potentially very real here. And whether you like it or not, I mean, the first major public disclosure of this was on your show. So, hey, might as well take credit when if this thing, goes viral and it really becomes a viable source of energy that improves everyone's lives. Hey, Joe, you're due some credit, man.
I think we can both agree that in antiquity, they may have used this technology to especially build megastructures like the pyramids. But if they did use it, do you think it was lost to a catastrophic earth change, or perhaps they used the technology for weapons and destroyed themselves?
Okay, really interesting questions, Jeff. Loaded questions. As far as the weaponization, now Malcolm says that there's two ways of generating plasmoids: in air and in water. And the plasmoids that are generated in water have a different quality than those generated in air. Don't ask me to explain the difference at this point. Maybe you and I can reconvene in a couple of months to do a follow-up, which I'd be happy to do. Maybe I'll be able to explain it. But he says, yeah, there is potential for that, but not from the water-generated plasmoids. And from what I've seen, it seems to me like the effects of them are really pretty beneficial. That and again, I don't really understand that, and don't claim to understand that. He has said that it's very possible that you could use it to create weapons, but not with the system that he has developed. That's the bottom line there. Not with the system he's developed. But like with anything, you can. I mean, look, electricity has made people's lives immeasurably better. We're sitting here without electricity. What would we be doing? We wouldn't be having this conversation. All of the things, that the benefits of electricity, but at the same time, if you misuse it, it can kill you, and they made, electrical chairs. So, which to me isn't such a great use of electricity but that's the point, I mean, there's nothing that's 100% good or 100% evil. That's the whole meaning of that yin yang symbol. If you picture the yin yang, the white figure has the little black dot, and the black figure has the little white dot. So yeah, there's always that potential. But because of the fact that there's a potential downside to electricity, that it could be used in a weapons context. Does that mean we abandon electricity and go back to living a brutal existence, an early 19th century existence when there was no electricity? I don't know of anybody, who would want to be willing to do that. So I think that's how we have to look at it. The question of did ancient, for a long time, and you probably felt this too, or thought this, that, there's so much that we've gotten from the legacy of the past that just doesn't seem to fit the conventional models of prehistory. Are we in kind of, I think we're in agreement on that, right? That there's so much that just doesn't add up within the idea that up until, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, from the late going back to the early Paleolithic, it was nothing but hunter-gatherers and small tribes, and they never advanced beyond that, which I always found to be, well, kind of incredible, because consider this, Jeff, how, like, I make this point all the time, when my grandparents were born, it was the 1890s, right? Late 1890s. Well, you had trains, electricity was just in its infancy, but the major mode of transportation was by horseback or on foot or horse-drawn or mule-drawn carriage. You had trains by then, but you could go back to the grandparents of my grandparents and there were no trains, right? Think about how quickly and how far we've advanced technologically in 4 generations or 5 generations. Now, there are modern human skeletal remains that are now being dated to 180 to even possibly 200,000 years old. Just did a quick calculation. If you figure 25 years to a generation, I'll plug it in right here. I got my calculator right here. Let's say that modern humans go back 200,000 years. If I divide by 25, that's 8,000 generations.
Wow.
Now, within the prevailing models of prehistory, we're supposed to believe that modern humans with the same cranial capacity and presumably the same intelligence as modern humans never invented anything, never came up with any scientific understanding of how the world works, of natural law, did not create any kind of a body of knowledge that would be passed on and evolved over generations. When you think about what we've accomplished in 5 generations, how easy would it be for our work of 5 or 6 generations to get lost in the noise of 8,000 generations? So to just just dismiss out of hand any possibility of there being more to our ancient past, to me, is premature. It's very close-minded. I think we need to be able to reconsider what may or may not have happened in the past. And like you, in our pre-show conversation, I think you brought up the pyramid, or maybe, when we look at, see, the thing is, as a builder, I've been a builder. I'm a 3rd-generation builder. So I've had some experience with knowing what it's like to have to move, things that weigh a half a ton or a ton and what's involved in that, right? When you're talking about all over the world, our ancestors moving with apparent impunity stones that might weigh 10 or 50 or 100 or 200 tons or more. Now, you could think, okay, maybe you're going to have an outlier culture that for whatever reason was obsessed with moving big stones, and they went and put forth all of this tremendous labor and effort to quarry and move 100-ton stones and build these temples. Okay, maybe that would not be too bizarre, but it was all over the world. There are dozens now of cultures through time and around the world that have apparently been able to cut and quarry and move gigantic stones. That was the thing that led me early on to thinking they had to have had some kind of technological means of doing this that was widespread, that was well known, and we've forgotten it. We've lost it because it just doesn't make sense. We had when I did this 3 or 4 years ago, I was on Rogan with Graham Hancock and Michael Sherman, who's a well-known skeptic.
Yeah.
And I met Michael. He seemed like a great guy, actually. And I am a firm believer that there's an important role for skeptics. There is, because otherwise the woo-woo would just go crazy. And I'm sure in the line of stuff that you're looking in and exploring, you know that it's always important to be somewhat skeptical about the things you hear, right?
Right.
Right. So, anyways, the idea is that if you've got an ancient culture, I'll say the assumption is that, okay, somehow these hunter-gatherers had enough leisure time that they were able to engage in monumental architecture. And no, we know that we've seen in the 19th and 20th centuries, hunter-gatherer societies. How many of them engaged in monumental architecture? Name one. Name just one. This doesn't seem to be something that you're going to be doing. You spend a great deal of your time hunting and gathering, and then you've got your leisure time. Okay, it would make sense that you might, you know, create jewelry. We know even Neanderthals were creating art and stuff. Yeah, but quarrying 100-ton stones and moving them over mountains and over vast distances, it just doesn't add up. And the fact that so many of these structures all over the world have this astronomical component, which I know you're well aware of, that so many of these structures have alignments to key astronomical moments and auspicious points in the sky and so on. Again, that's universal. How is it, okay, you can use Stonehenge or one of these big structures to know when to plant, right? And when to reap and when to sow. Well, yeah, but you can do the same thing by putting a stick in the ground. You don't need to build a huge monumental temple with alignments to the equinoctial or solstitial alignments, rising points of the sun. You certainly don't need to monumentalize the 18.6 year lunar cycle. For why in the world would you do that? Well, I think, and I'll tell you this, and I'm thinking, and I think I can back this up with some evidence that all of this is part of a technological system. You made the reference to the pyramid. Well, here's an interesting fact, that when people go online now and they look at these videos and they see the technology, you'll see that you've got these tubes with spheres, right? And argon gas is used as the medium to move the plasmas through this machinery. There's no moving parts in it. It just like with the Hiltz vortex tube, there's no moving parts. It's just the air that's going into a particular geometry. It's going into a motion, a vorticular motion, and it separates the cold and the warm components of room temperature air. And it's a wild thing. Nobody really knows how. There's ideas about how the thing works, that are still being debated. But the point is, it works to the extent that industry is utilizing the vortex tube. Okay. So it's very similar to that. Now, one of the things is that the pipes there's a series of concentric pipes and concentric spheres. Okay. The ratios of those components, whether it's the pipes or the spheres, are very precise in order to optimize the functioning of the technology. And what's interesting to me is that the numbers that define those ratios are numbers that we find reiteratively occurring in the Vedas, in the Sumerian traditions, in the Bible, etc. And while I knew that for years I've studied these numbers, mostly from the context of architecture, because over and over again, not only are we finding the engineering capabilities of these ancient builders are impressively phenomenal, we also find that there's this astronomical component that's consistent universally all over the world. But there's this other dimension too as well, which is geometry. And that over and over again, we find the same ratios, proportions, and the numbers that are emerging that define those ratios and proportions. 432 is an example of a number that recurs over and over again. 864, 792. These are 108. These are numbers that we find embedded in ancient structures over and over and over again, right? Turns out that these numbers also define the optimum ratios for this system, the ratios of the tubes to the spheres and so on. And if you deviate from that, it loses efficiency. It's not optimally functioning, right? Now, one of the things is when you make the transition from the tube to the sphere, you can't just take and punch a round hole in the sphere and put the round tube into it. There has to be a transition in order, because it's all about keeping the motion, the move. It's the process, just like with the vortex tube, is in the motion of the air through the thing. Just like here, it's the motion of the argon carrying the plasma through the machine. Okay, so there has to be a transition between the pipe, the tube, and the sphere. So through experimentation, through empirical testing, an angle was discovered that seems to be the optimum angle to make that transition for guiding that flow from the tube to the sphere. Turns out that angle is 51.84 degrees. Now, is this a coincidence that the slope to base angle of the Great Pyramid of Khufu is 51.84 degrees? And could that be a little hint that, like you kind of alluded to earlier, that perhaps the pyramid was part of a technological system? And I think we could say perhaps yes. I think we could put that forward as a hypothesis to be tested.
I love that you brought up Stonehenge, because I saw a documentary on it one time about how they moved these blocks and they created some kind of railway system. But at the end of the documentary, to me, was the most important thing. And that was they moved these blocks 200 miles. And in that time, most people never traveled over 10 or 20 miles in their entire life.
In their entire lives. Yes, Jeff. Yes. That's what I'm saying. It's like, once you get into the details, things just aren't adding up. There's a much deeper, more complex history of the human species on planet Earth than conventional models have up to this point recognized or been willing to recognize. And you brought up the question of catastrophism earlier, and clearly that's the thing that I focus on. You said you've got some geological training. I'm a college dropout. But like you, I thought, okay, if I go forward and I get my degree in geology, what's that going to serve me? I can get a job with industry or government primarily. I wasn't interested in that. My interest was in understanding how the world works, how this planet we live on, what its story is, how it works, and so on. And so after, a couple of years, I also realized, you know what? I can learn faster on my own, because there's a lot of extraneous stuff that I would need to study to get a degree. I would rather spend that time out in the field, which I've done, thousands of hours in the field, and managed to ally myself with dozens of degreed geologists who have different perspectives and points of view on the geological history of this planet. Now, you can't tell me that going out and spending 3 or 4 days in the field with an expert, let's say, in drumlin topography, is going to be any less valuable than sitting in a room with 50 students watching a professor talk, or watching a video of the professor talking about that subject. Now, I utilize very much, there's so much good stuff online now, where you can go and download and watch stuff on YouTube and other venues for education. But why is, and see, this is where and some of the attacks that I've been on the receiving end of, people trying to discredit me, say, well, he has no credentials. like, well, my response to that is, look, there's thousands of people out there with lots of credentials, and I think they're total fools. But that's a different topic. But here's the point. I've only spent 40 years studying geology. Like I said, I've spent thousands of hours in the field. I've read thousands of scientific papers. I've collaborated with or studied under or been out in the field with dozens of geologists, right? Now, the attacks that people, oh, well, he has no credentials. Well, so it's like these little arrogant, whatever you want to call them, narcissists or whatever, they're going to throw all of that out. Why? Because they're afraid, I think, of the evidence that I'm bringing to the table and trying to get under discussion. For example, the catastrophic history of this planet and the fact that one of the things that our ancient ancestors were well aware of is that there are times when everything basically goes crazy. And we can see the evidence of that in multiple different ways. I just got back a few days ago from leading a tour up in western Montana, up near not too far from Glacier National Park. And I'm showing the evidence of gigantic terminal ice age megafloods that occurred on such a scale that it's almost impossible to grasp the magnitude of these floods. But, I've spent many, many, many hours traversing many, many, many miles documenting and studying the effects of these catastrophes, the giant catastrophes. So my take now is that, yeah, the ancients in some way actually had a more realistic model of Earth history than modern academia that's locked into this gradualistic paradigm. They understood that this planet is periodically subjected to tremendous upheavals. And if we're not prepared for that, I think the legacy of civilization on Earth tends to be, or is that, just like species, we now used to think in the old Darwinian models that species were constantly undergoing this gradualistic transition, so that any given time, let's say 10% of species are going extinct while 10% of species are evolving into the new species. Well, of course, that raises the question of, well, a species is defined, if two species are different, it's because there's no viable reproductive possibility between those two species, right? But the whole Darwinian evolution model is very gradualistic. It's very incremental, right? It raises the question, well, where are all the transitional species rather than we see the endpoints of the continuum, but where's the transitional species? Well, the model that has evolved now, really, and what the evidence is showing is that it's not a gradual transition. There are wholesale episodes of mass species extinctions that have occurred geologically in an eye blink. And then you have a hiatus, and then you have this mysterious, still unexplained process that is referred to as rapid speciation, where after a given amount of time, suddenly there's a whole lot of species proliferating, and the fossils, you have a lot of fossils, then there's an extinction level event. The fossil record is now impoverished of the remains of animals. Permian, Triassic, 90% of all animals, marine and terrestrial, disappeared for a hiatus. This is like same with the Cretaceous Tertiary. The dinosaurs disappeared. You had marine animals that disappeared. You had faunal turnover as well as flora turnover. So there was a tremendous global change in environment and climate and everything that went along with it. Then there's this mysterious period, this hiatus, and then all of a sudden, there's all of these new new species show up in the fossil record. Okay, now take that same idea, and I think that just now we know that there are both endogenous, meaning from within the earth, and exogenous, meaning from without the earth. And I think that they work together. And what happens is periodically there will be a series of multiple impact events from comet debris or asteroids from space. Oftentimes that will be accompanied with episodic volcanism, which I tend to think is going to be a response. If you take a 1 mile or 2 mile wide asteroid, accelerated to 20 times the speed of the muzzle velocity of a rifle bullet, and you slam that into the earth, that's going to create a tremendous amount of havoc and destruction and induce climate change. I think one of the consequences of that we can look at is potentially effects in the geomagnetic field. Also, effects in seismic and earthquake activity, changes in climate like the onset or termination of an ice age, also episodes of spasmodic volcanism as a response to that. But whatever the exact mix of effects, and these are natural effects, whether cosmic, so what I mean by exogenous outside the earth, or endogenous from within, or that the fact that they work together. What we know is that it's almost certain now that these massive extinction episodes in Earth history are triggered by this kind of phenomena. Well, now what I'm saying is we need to look at the evolution and history of human civilization on Earth. And what it's appearing is that the same type of phenomena is the case. Just as species have gone extinct in these natural upheavals, civilizations have gone extinct.
About 12,000 years ago was the last ice age, right?
Yes. Yes.
Something happened, I think, rather quickly that melted all the ice and caused the flooding. Is that flooding event what the Bible talks about and so many other cultures talk about, the Great Flood?
Well, that is an excellent question, Jeff. My interpretation of it now is that the flooding at the end of the ice age was probably not the source of the Noah story. I think and this is still awaiting more proof, but there is some evidence that there was a major bolide impact into the Indian Ocean around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago that would have created enormous tsunamis that would have affected all the coastlines on the Indian Ocean. The Arabian Sea is almost like a Venturi flume leading to the Persian Gulf. And any tsunami moving up through the Arabian Sea from the Indian Ocean is going to, as it's making landfall, is going to rise up and become a very huge event, perhaps making landfall at least a minimum of 100, maybe 200, 300, 400 feet in height, in wave height, which would have a tremendous run-in potential. I tend to think that that's the account of the Noah flood. If we go to Plato as a source, and I can never recommend people reading his two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. He says right there in the introductory words to talking about the legend of Atlantis, Plato talks about the Egyptian tradition of there being multiple floods and multiple destructions. And I think that the geological evidence bears that out. It looks like the melting of the great ice sheets at the end of the last ice age. From what I'm seeing now, it looks like there were 3 major pulses of melting. One at 14, and if assuming the dating has not been biased by circumstances such as a cosmic impact that might, for example, temporarily cause the collapse of the geomagnetic field, which would allow more cosmic rays to come in, galactic cosmic rays, which then create proxies, for example, beryllium-10 and carbon-14, which we can now use as a proxy to understand solar variability. We know that the sun acts as a buffer that prevents cosmic rays from impinging upon the Earth that could have deleterious consequences. But aside from that, assuming that the dating is being used, which is radiocarbon dating and primarily optically stimulated luminescence, OSL dating, which I'm not going to get into what that is, other than it's basically, the fact that there are isotopes created in crystalline structure, primarily quartz and feldspar, that can be affected by the amount of, it's sort of like an atomic clock. And if it's exposed to the sun, it resets the atomic clock. That's the basic idea. But anyhow, it looks like There was a major pulse of global melting at 14,600 years ago, a second pulse coinciding with the younger Dryas boundary at about 12,900 years ago, and then a third and final major pulse of meltwater injected into the global oceans at 11,600. So you got a 3,000 year span there. The elimination of the ice. Now you got to bear in mind, we're talking about during the late glacial maximum, when the ice was at its maximum extent around the Earth. It was more than double the amount of ice now. There was two great ice sheets over North America that started independently but grew to the extent where they eventually coalesced. The larger of the two was called the Laurentide ice sheet. It was probably 1.5 miles thick at its maximum. Its center was over what is now more or less Hudson Bay. And it nucleated around there and then grew out onto the western prairies of Canada. Meanwhile, over the Canadian Rockies from northern United States up to Alaska, you had a secondary ice cap ice sheet forming. Eventually, it's called a Cordilleran. So the western ice sheet, which at its maximum was roughly the size of the modern day Greenland ice sheet, and the Laurentide ice sheet, which at its maximum was roughly the size of the Antarctic ice sheet. Then in addition to that, you had a major ice complex over northwestern Europe. The result of all of this accumulated ice was that sea levels were lowered by at least 400 feet. Okay, so now getting rid of that ice and going from a full glacial to an interglacial like we're in now was not accomplished all at once. I think that the evidence shows there were three major transitionary phases, short-lived, catastrophic transitionary phases within that 3,000 years. And the result was that we went from almost full glacial at, say, 15,000 years ago to only residual ice after 11,600. Now, there was a considerable amount of residual ice that would have taken another couple of thousand years to melt away. So this, to me, it's kind of compounded the complexity of what happened, is because I think you've got several pulses of extreme melting that occurred, and they're juxtaposed on a series of smaller melting events that are probably more seasonally attributable rather than something greater. I think that the trigger, two potentials for trigger. Candidate number one, impacts probably of the debris of a fragmenting comet, which Earth may have encountered a debris swarm several times during this interval, right? The likely source of that debris stream, the remnants of that, the most likely candidate would be the Taurid meteor stream, which we're just starting, the planet is starting to enter into the outer edges of that. It will peak from about Halloween to the 4th or 5th of November. That will be the peak of the Taurid meteor stream. And I've done a whole presentation of the origins of the universal origins of the Halloween Day of the Dead and its connections with the catastrophes, the great floods, and the Taurid meteor stream. So impacts of things from space, number one. Number two, a much greater variability in the sun could also be playing a role. I think that maybe one of the things that we're seeing might be characterized as a perfect storm, because to get the planet out of the depths of the ice age is a really complex process, which shouldn't have occurred. Because with that much ice, it's dramatically altered the albedo of the Earth, which means the reflectivity. So that if you everybody knows that if you have a white shirt on and you're in the hot sun, the white will reflect heat. You put a black shirt on, and now that's absorbing heat. That's the albedo. You got a lot of area covered in ice or snow. That's reflecting a tremendous amount of heat back into space that's now lost, right? An ice age, it has been said by some glaciologists that an ice age should almost be self-perpetuating. But then it takes some kind of a trigger from outside the system to interrupt that process. And to me, the most likely trigger is going to be something from space, probably an impact. And now there is a tremendous amount of evidence supporting the idea of an impact. There are proxies being found all over the planet, nanodiamonds, microspherules, magnetic grains, iridium, platinum, all of these things that are the signatures of some kind of a cosmic impact. The other thing is, we've been deploying solar observing satellites since the early 90s. We're learning that the sun is far more variable than anybody imagined, pre-satellite observation. The prevailing idea of the sun was the solar constant. In other words, the output of the sun doesn't vary enough to even be concerned about. That was the solar constant idea of the sun, was the totally dominant idea when the whole global warming thing started being pushed between 1988 and 1992, right? So if you assume that the variability of the sun is non-existent or so insignificant that you can ignore it, well, then what they did was the role of the sun was not incorporated into the computer models. However, we now know that the sun, there's much evidence to suggest that the sun is far more variable than the earlier assumptions. And there's also something else very interesting. There seems to be a connection, and this is not proven yet, but it's a tantalizing connection that would seem to suggest that the infall of cometary masses into the chromosphere seems to have a connection with coronal mass ejections and solar storms. Now, if that proves to be true, this may have really significant implications. If you have, and one of these theories is that around 25 to 30,000 years ago, a very large comet, probably dislodged from the Kuiper disk, made its way towards the sun, and as it passed through the zone of the planets and then as it approached the sun, it did what all comets tend to do towards the ends of their life cycles. It began to disintegrate. Well, if you have a comet nucleus that's 50 to 100 miles in diameter, the debris of that disintegration can be copious. We know from the event of 1908, Tunguska 1908, the Siberian event. You've heard of that, right? The Tunguska.
Right.
Okay, so you know that one small object, 50 meters in diameter, roughly 150 feet, carried the energy of a 15 megaton hydrogen bomb, which could wipe out any urban civilization, any urban center on Earth. I mean, there was over 820 miles of old growth taiga forest that was utterly decimated by this aerial detonation of the Tunguska object. Now, it's important to emphasize aerial detonation because a lot of the models of how vulnerable Earth is to cosmic impacts were based upon crater counting. Well, crater counting is when you have a substantially large object. If it's low density, it might need to be a half a mile in diameter. If it's high density, like an iron asteroid, we can look at are you familiar with the famous crater in Arizona near Winslow?
Yeah, I've been there a couple times.
You've been there?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. That's great. That gives you a framework for thinking about it. It's a hell of a big hole, isn't it?
Yes.
Pretty impressive, right?
Yes.
It was produced by an iron asteroid, roughly the same diameter, the same volume as the object that exploded in the air over Siberia in 1908. The difference is the Arizona object was dense, like iron, almost like cast iron. And it survived its passage through the atmosphere and struck the ground and excavated this tremendous hole. The Tunguska object was low density. It did not survive its passage through the atmosphere. It exploded about 5 miles up. Now, it completely wiped out, like I said, something like 825 square miles of old growth taiga forest. But what's happening is now, more than a century later, forest has recovered, and another century or two, if you didn't know about this event, it could go completely unknown, right? The Arizona object has left a hole in the ground. It's been there 50,000 years. But here's the thing. If your models of catastrophism acknowledge the role of direct impacts, and your direct impacts is the census of direct impacts is based upon holes in the ground, actual craters, well, you're going to miss the things like Tunguska, which actually the evidence would suggest are far more prevalent than the actual impacts into the ground. And in fact, you might have a swarm of Tunguskas type events that explode in the atmosphere, but would have no trace other than perhaps maybe in an anomalous iridium deposit. There'd be no trace, 10,000 years later that this had happened.
Yeah, that
And
makes
some
a
of
lot
the
of
models,
sense.
and some of the models that have been devised would suggest just that. Also, the thing is that the low density objects are much more copious, much more numerous than the high density objects. In fact, the estimate I've seen is that for every crater that we count in the ground, and that the census worldwide is about roughly 200 craters, and that's really only, gauging from roughly 15% of the surface area. I mean, almost 3/4 of the planet is ocean. So if you have an object 50 meters in diameter, like the Arizona object, landing in the ocean, well, you're going to have a tsunami, but you're not going to have a crater to count. See? So I think that we're underestimating the number of cosmic encounters to which this planet has been subjected. And that a lot of these cosmic encounters are lower density objects that don't leave the big craters in the ground. And the census, the counting, the low density objects are much more numerous than the high density objects. So that needs to be factored in. And now there's interesting new work suggesting that Abu Huraira was destroyed 12,900 years ago by a large aerial burst along the lines of the Tunguska event, except even more powerful. And this is the kind of evidence now that we're beginning to see, and we're beginning to see it because we're looking for it, whereas 20 years ago and 30 years ago, we weren't looking for it.
In the beginning, I said that you lead tours, over 50 tours to sites of antiquity. Have you toured Egypt? And if so, what kind of
Yes.
geologic evidence have you seen there that could have taken out the ancient Egyptians?
Okay. The main evidence I've seen there is the wadis that feed into the Nile Valley. And these things are enormous. A lot of them have no water flowing in them now, but they're enormous channels. And how I know that they were mega floods that carved these channels is by looking at the deposits left behind. And so you can look at the wadis and you'll see that there are gigantic boulder accumulations at the mouths of the wadis. Also, papers that I've read suggest that there were like freshwater diatoms and other microscopic creatures that had been found and dated to roughly last ice age that are up to 120 to 150 feet above the modern floodplain of the Nile River. The other thing is that Eastern Mediterranean, and of course I haven't studied this, I haven't looked at this firsthand because what they have done is taken samples from the basin of the Eastern Mediterranean, sea bottom core samples, dredged them up, looked at them, and what you see is that there are intervals of normal accumulation, what you would call like marl, fine-grained sediment, mostly limey type of stuff. And then they are interrupted by these thick layers of what are called sapropel. Sapropel is material that's basically rotten mud, okay? These sapropelitic layers were flushed into the Eastern Mediterranean by gigantic floods coming down the Nile River. And so what they're doing is fresh water is less dense than salt water. Here's what happens. You get the water coming out of the Nile River is fresh, but it's supercharged with sediment, organic material, plants, and all kinds of stuff that it's, if you figure that the Nile River is going through these episodes, and in fact, geologists 20 and 30 years ago were looking at this, and they referred to these late Ice Age wild floods on the Nile River. Wild floods, right, is what they called them. They're flushing all of this organic material into the Eastern Mediterranean. As that water goes out, it dumps its load of organic sediment, and the sediment now would make that layer more dense. But when that sediment goes to the bottom, the fresh water forms a lid on top of the ocean, of the water of the Mediterranean. In normal processes, there's what's called the thermohaline convection loop. It's based upon density stratification. That loop can get interrupted by that lid of fresh water that's capping the salt water. When that happens, that loop is carrying oxygen down to the bottom of the water column. Okay. By carrying that oxygen down, it now would be able to normally oxidize organic material that has been deposited. But because of that interruption of that loop, that material that has been flushed in is not oxidizing. And so it forms these layers, these muddy layers. When they pull up the cores, it stinks because it's semi-rotten material. The sapropelitic layers show that there is almost a cyclical periodicity to these great flooding events. And then again, go back to Plato. The Egyptian priests are telling Solon exactly that there are multiple floods, and in their sacred registers of 9,000 years, they know of many events like this that have happened. Whereas you Greeks are like children because you only know of 3 floods, right? So yes, the answer, Jeff, is yes. The evidence is there. I'm familiar. I know Robert Schoch. I respect him, his work on dating the Sphinx. He was brought in by John Anthony West decades ago now to evaluate the erosion on the Sphinx. Mainstream Egyptologists don't want to accept the fact that the evidence of the Sphinx on the Sphinx. It's difficult now to look at the Sphinx because there's been so many restoration campaigns on the Sphinx. But where the evidence is graphically, unambiguously displayed is on the walls of the ditch, the limestone bedrock forming the walls of the ditch around the Sphinx, where very clearly it's water erosion. I've looked at many, many examples of water erosion. I've studied the erosional attributes of limestone to try to understand. And I think it's unambiguous that, yes, we're looking at limestone. I mean, we're looking at water erosion there. The question is when did that erosion take place? Schoch has speculated publicly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, or that the Sphinx has been there that long. I think it goes back earlier than that. The Sphinx is roughly around 120 feet above the Nile, which is almost at sea level there near the Giza Plateau. So if the Nile rose 150 feet, it's going to spread out of the channel and it's going to submerge the Sphinx. It's going to submerge large parts of the Giza Plateau. Alternatively, as you go west of Giza, you're essentially ascending. It's an ascending terrain. I've looked at evidence from studies, now satellite surveys, subsurface radar surveys, that would suggest that there have been tremendous floods, surface floods, that have come off of from areas like Libya and so forth, that would have been rainfall induced. Is it possible that erosion was accomplished over? We've got basically 2 scenarios. One is that the erosion, and in some cases, the recession of the original quarry face, because It was a rock quarry. The blocks that were quarried out of the ditch around the main body of the Sphinx were then used to build the Sphinx temple, immediately to the east. Okay, so now here's the question. You quarry these blocks, and if you look at a typical limestone quarry, you've got this stepped profile, and you can even go back and look at Old Kingdom quarries, and you still see the stepped profile, which has eroded so minimally that in some cases you can tell whether it was a pick or a chisel that was used on the block. You can still see the pick marks. Yet the Sphinx quarry, the Sphinx ditch walls, in some places have had as much as 2 feet of limestone material removed. Now, how do you do that? You either have to do it over a very short period of time, catastrophically, where you have sheet floods coming over the walls of the edge of the ditch, highly corrosive because they're laden with sediment and probably sand and stuff, or it's going to be erosion that takes place over a very long period of time. And I've done studies on limestone erosional rates from a number of different sources. For example, looking at a limestone, say, headstone in a graveyard that actually has the date on it, right? You go back, and if there's a historic cemetery, there's a headstone made out of limestone, and it's got the date 1860 in it. Well, you can now go, okay, let's take a look at how much erosion has occurred on that limestone structure, and we know when it was, how long it's been sitting there subjected to rain. There's also been studies where, for example, a single cubic foot block of limestone was placed on the roof of the Smithsonian Institute. Okay, and then they observed over a period of decades of how rapidly that limestone block was eroded by sitting in an environment where you had 40 some inches of rainfall per year. Now, in the deserts of northern Egypt, you're looking at 5%, 5 inches, 10 inches of rainfall per year. So the erosion rates are going to be very much slower. So no matter how you slice that pie, either it's going to be a rapid process, meaning catastrophic water flows, or it's going to be a much longer, slower process, meaning that the quarrying of the Sphinx ditch had to have taken place many thousands of years ago. In either way, it's not consistent with the models of the Egyptologists, and so they tend to ignore that evidence. But it's right there in your face, and the arguments made in favor of the current model, the prevailing model, to me just don't add up, because they say silly stuff like, well, we know that a block of limestone fell off of the Sphinx, the shoulder of the Sphinx, like this was like 20 years ago or something, right? Well, so why do we need long periods of rainfall to accomplish the erosion of the Sphinx? And then I would point out the obvious. Well, a block of limestone falling off the shoulder of the Sphinx is something very different than what we're seeing on the quarry walls. And the fact of the matter is, this was civilization and a highway, a road going right next there to the Giza complex, with big trucks rumbling and the vibrations and everything. Well, yeah, we shouldn't be surprised that a block might fall off. But that has nothing to do with what we're looking at on the quarry walls, the Sphinx ditch quarry walls. That's something very different. So, so what do I lean towards? I lean towards a kind of a combination of perhaps a series of catastrophic floods, which means, because if we look at the rates of erosion of limestone based upon even like that Smithsonian test, we're still needing 30 or 40,000 years to remove 2 feet. So what's more probable, that that quarrying was done 30 or 40,000 years ago, or maybe 15,000 years ago, and you had an accelerated rate of erosion? I don't know the answer to it. But whatever the answer is, it's not consistent with the prevailing models of Egyptian prehistory.
Not to be the boy who cried wolf here, but are we due for another catastrophic event?
Oh, we're overdue. We're overdue.
Hmm.
If we look at the geological and climatological record, the longest period of interglacial, more or less consistent climate is the Holocene, the one we're in now, which is roughly a little more than 11,000 years old. I mean, let's see here. I could pull up something and show you here. We haven't looked at any images. Let me see if I've got something handy here, and I can pull it up, and I think it'll dramatically underscore what we're looking at here. All right, here we go.
While you're pulling that up, I want to just kind of add this to the question. And what I want to add is, if we're due for something, could there be an event that would send us back into another ice age?
I think the answer to that would be yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think that the most likely candidate for such a thing would be a cosmic impact of some kind. Because, see, an impact into land is going to do two things. It's going to ignite widespread fire, which is now going to inject soot and smoke into the atmosphere. An impact into the ocean is going to inject water vapor into the atmosphere. Now, sending particulate matter and smoke and soot into the atmosphere is going to reflect sunlight and cause global cooling. An impact into the ocean is going to do the opposite. It's going to create a canopy of water vapor, which is going to act, and water vapor is the most effective greenhouse gas. Okay. It's going to create a canopy of water vapor that's going to capture that long wave radiation being emitted from the earth, that's roughly in this window of 15 to 17 micron wavelength. That's going to cause runaway short-lived global warming. Now, here's to me where it gets interesting, Jeff, is what if we are talking about a multiple impact event where you not only have impacts into land, you have impacts into the ocean. And I think, having thought about this for years and years, I think that this is a plausible scenario for launching an ice age. Number one, you're going to have a short-lived injection of water vapor into the atmosphere. At the same time, when you do cloud seeding, one of the things that, in order to break droughts, for example, if you can introduce fine grained particulate matter into the atmosphere, it acts as a nucleus for the formation of a raindrop. That's the whole idea behind cloud seeding, right? Now, if you have a multiple impact event, you're going to get introduced a huge amount of particulate matter into the atmosphere from the land impacts. You're going to have the injection of huge amounts of water vapor, so you're going to now have tremendous amounts of rainfall. Now, if the water vapor dissipates and clears out first, and you still have dust, an enormous amount of dust, and in an impact, one of the things that occurred during the Tunguska event was, because it exploded in the atmosphere, it injected a lot of very fine-grained material into the atmosphere, right? Now, if you have a multiple impact event, which, if you're talking about a fragmented comet, you might be talking about stuff from the size of your fingernail all the way up to something a mile or two in diameter and everything in between, right? Which is the thing that makes it so damn complicated to try to sort all this out. But I think we may have a mechanism there to launch an ice age, because let's say you have a lot of rain out, but you also have this global cooling, what has been referred to as cosmic winter. So instead of the rainfall falling and then becoming part of the hydrological cycle and eventually making its way back to the ocean, it freezes on the land. And now it changes the albedo, right? And you may also have this canopy of dust and soot and stuff still airborne. And so I think somewhere in there, we may have a mechanism, because see, the problem with an ice age, Jeff, is this. you've got to have a rapid accumulation of snow over the latitudes where ice sheets form, which means you have to have a lot of water vapor in the atmosphere. But in order to get that water vapor into the atmosphere, you have to have heat. You have to have thermal energy. So this has been a conundrum that's puzzled glaciologists and climatologists for years. How do you accomplish these two things simultaneously? Well, the problem is up until the last few decades, virtually all of the models for the onset or termination of an ice age were based upon very slow gradualistic processes. One, what are called the Milankovitch processes, which just has to do with the changing orbital geometries between Earth and the sun. The problem there is these factors operate on a time scale that's so gradual that it cannot explain these extremely rapid changes in temperature and climate, which I'm about to show you on a graph here momentarily, right? But outside of that, that was considered to be the consensus view. Once with the advent of radiocarbon dating after the 50s and 60s, it became apparent that a lot of these processes were a lot faster than anybody had previously estimated. So how do we account for that? Well, nobody was really looking at the big picture. Nobody was looking at the exogenic realm. They were mostly looking at processes internal to the Earth itself. I think now that we are beginning to realize that our planet is part of a much greater cosmic ecosystem that includes the sun, that includes comets and asteroids, includes the entire architecture of the solar system. We now can expand our thinking to that scale. And now we might be able to have some hope of answering some of these puzzling questions. Okay. Anyhow, going back to the question of periodicity and cycles and so on, let's see if I can pull this up here. These are oxygen isotopes in Greenland. And what we're seeing here is oxygen isotopes are a proxy for temperature change. And this is the Holocene we're looking at. If we look down the right side from 0 to 10, this is thousands of years. So this is the present, and this is 10,000 years ago down. I'm going down the right-hand side of the screen. You're going over here. So shifts to the left means that the climate is getting colder. Shifts to the right means it's getting warmer. And the variability here, it's based on oxygen isotope ratios that are found in the ice. They're a proxy for the temperature of the air at the time the snow was deposited, because the glaciers form each year. There's snowfall, and the snowfall, there's not enough heat to melt the annual accumulation of snow, so it builds up and forms layers. And just like you could count tree rings, you can go in and you can count layers of snow and get a determination of how much time, how many years has passed, and so on. Okay, so what we see here is a variability of 2 to 4 degrees centigrade. Okay, now to provide a context here, the planet Earth, and this is what all the models concur and has shown, that the planet Earth has warmed by about 1 degree centigrade over the last 100 years, since the early 20th century. Remember, we always hear that, the point of no return is 1.5 degrees. Well, if it warms up 1.5 degrees over and above pre-industrial concentrations of carbon dioxide, which is presumed to be the sole and only driver of climate change at this point, if you assume that it's going to warm 1.5 degrees, a degree and a half, it goes beyond that, warming from the pre-industrial average temperature, well, we're doomed. Then it's going to be, the point of no return. It's going to be the tipping point, and we're all doomed, right? Well, what this assumption ignores is the fact that there have been many times, throughout the history of this planet, even recently, when the temperatures have been more than 1.5 degrees warmer than now. Also, a whole lot colder than now. And also, this, the idea that we hear over and over again, which is completely false, is that extreme weather events are now happening with greater intensity and greater frequency. This is not true. And this is only believed by people who have no knowledge of paleoclimatology, which is the study of climate that preceded the scientific monitoring of climate change. We can look at any of the variables of climate change, the manifestations of climate change, whether it's hurricanes, droughts, fires, floods, tornadoes, etc. And I've done this extensively, exhaustively, showing the actual data on my Cosmographia podcast, that there have always been extreme weather events, right? Now, let's go back to the graph here. There's like, for example, Jeff, can you see this little spike right down here?
Yes.
To the left?
Mm-hmm.
That was a period of global cooling where the climate rapidly, geologically in an eye blink, cooled by about 4 degrees centigrade. It lasted for maybe a century or two, and then the climate rapidly warmed again. This happened about 8,300 years ago. So this is within the Holocene. Remember, the Holocene is now dated as the modern epoch. It's dated at about 11,600 years. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to show you. Now, again, you see that there's no point in here where this is not a smooth, straight line. It's showing that the climate over Greenland has been fluctuating, which is really pretty much can be made the case for the northern hemisphere, right? Because you're not going to have climate changes like this in isolation, because the global climate and weather is a unified system. Okay, so you don't have somehow this is segregated from anything else that's going on. One of the controversies about the little ice age that we have been in, that the planet was in for over 500 years, that only ended in the mid 1800s, was that it was only region and it didn't represent global climate change. Well, that's been completely disproven, that the little ice age and the preceding medieval warm period were global in extent, not regional. Okay. The medieval warm period, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the medieval warm period, which lasted roughly for about 300 years, from 1000 AD to 1300 AD, was warmer than now. I mean, this is the period when Scandinavians were colonizing Greenland and had farms where it's now permafrost. It's the time when there was a flourishing wine industry in England, right? During the medieval warm period. There's evidence that sea level might have been 2 to 4 feet higher than now. There's tree lines have been documented to have gone up by hundreds of feet during the medieval warm period. It was real. It was warmer than now. People don't know this, though, because the mainstream media narrative that they're putting out is to create this scenario that it's all unprecedented. I can only call BS on that. But what I want to do is let's go back beyond the Holocene so that you can get an idea of the kind of variability to which this planet has been subjected over the last 250,000 years, which is how far back this chronology goes based upon these ice cores. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I've only taken the top half of the slide. And let me go back one. You'll notice right down here, Jeff, that it's like trending off to the left.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's leaning towards the cold end of the spectrum, all right? Well, what's happening there is we're seeing the last gasp of the global climate coming out of the ice age. Okay, so now let's go here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in the rest of the course that shows the climatic variability throughout the last 200,000 years.
Wow, it's a big change.
Yeah. I would say so. Now, how come nobody in mainstream media, how come nobody pushing the global warming agenda is even talking about this? I would like to know the answer to that question. And the answer is I think it's deliberate. If they even know about it, they're deliberately avoiding talking about it. But if you look down right here, you can see, now you want to talk about global warming? Look at this right here. Here's global warming, where the climate was way warmer than it is now. Now, right up here, this is the transition out of the Ice Age. Right here, this spike off to the left is the younger Dryas, where the global climate spasmed to cold weather. And then notice this spike right here.
Are you pointing with, sorry to interrupt you, but are you pointing with them? There you go. Now your mouse is back.
Sorry. Right here. If you look at this spike right here, this was global warming. All right. Right here, this is global warming. This is global cooling here. This is the younger Dryas right in here. This spike right here is about 10 degrees centigrade, which is about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. The estimates are that this global warming occurred in less than 5 years, possibly even as little as 1 year. So where's the explanation for that? If somebody ever tells you, Jeff, that the debate about climate change is over and there's a consensus, challenge them with this data right here. And they won't have a response to it because they basically ignore this evidence. So I like to show this to people to show that the science is not settled. We have a lot to learn yet, just like we have a lot to learn about plasma physics and other things. It's time to blow the gates off these entrenched models of ancient history and look at it with new eyes, unbiased by, the prevailing academic dogmas of the last century or more. So yeah, that's kind of the message I'm trying to get to. And see, here's the thing. If the ultimate trigger of this is cosmic, and now that creates the potential of perhaps being able to prepare for such an event if it were to happen again. And the point you asked this earlier about, the are we due for something? And I said we're overdue, because if we look at the same types of models that I just showed you that show the intervals of relatively, compare the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, to what preceded it. Well, the stability of the modern Holocene climate has been such that we've been able to build civilization. Something else happened that's important for people to be aware of. When you talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for most of the history, Earth history, at least since life has been on the planet, carbon dioxide has been much higher than now, much higher. Right now, it's about 406 parts per million. Pre-industrial, it was about 280 parts per million. For most of Earth history, it was 1,000 parts per million or greater. If we go back to the late glacial maximum during the peak of the Ice Age, carbon dioxide concentrations got down to 180 parts per million. Now, what does that mean? Here's what that means. First, a little context. Okay. The ocean will draw down, it can suck up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's a gigantic reservoir that draws in carbon dioxide. Now, that carbon dioxide is now being used. It's actually tends to get sequestered ultimately by natural marine processes where microscopic creatures in the water column are using that carbon dioxide. The carbonate, their shells are built out of carbonate, right? So they're using that carbon. When they die, their corpses filter to the bottom of the ocean. And as it builds up, the pressure converts that sediment into limestone rock. There is a gigantic amount of carbon dioxide locked up in the limestone bedrock of the planet. It's a huge amount, far greater than the amount of carbon dioxide, by orders of magnitude, far greater than the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay. So, in fact, it has been said that if the atmospheric carbon dioxide wasn't being readily replenished, it would only take a few thousand years for the ocean to draw down all of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and put us in a carbon dioxide drought. Well, carbon dioxide has two functions within the natural order. One, it's a greenhouse gas. It captures that long wave radiation emitting from the earth in the form of heat within that window, which is the same window that water vapor captures. The other thing is it's the fuel for plants. It's without carbon dioxide, there's no photosynthesis. Okay, so what happens is that when you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it increases the intake of carbon dioxide by plants. Well, and if you decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's plant food, and what happens is plants literally can become malnourished, right? Now, a plant takes up a molecule of carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide, two oxygen molecules. It retains or incorporates the carbon molecule, one oxygen molecule, and it emits an oxygen molecule. So the process of photosynthesis is what keeps the atmosphere supplied with oxygen. At the same time, it fuels plant growth. Well, when you get down to 180 parts per million, you're at the threshold where the atmospheric pressure of carbon dioxide is too low. What happens is that plants begin to suffer. All that had to happen was for the carbon dioxide concentration to go down by 30 parts per million more. You know what would happen, Jeff? The biosphere would starve to death. We came this close to a biospheric catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Now, when the oceans get cold, they suck up carbon dioxide. When they get warm, they extrude carbon dioxide. Just think about, you open a carbonated drink. You open a can of Coke, right? Well, when it's under pressure, the carbon dioxide cannot be released. Or when it's cold, but if you warm it up, take the cap off and warm it up, all that carbon dioxide outgasses. And after a while, your Coke is going to be flat because the carbon dioxide is outgassed, right?
Right.
Well, the ocean will do that. The ocean will draw down. So if you have something causing a global cooling, the oceans will start now sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's another thing that can add to this self-perpetuating process of global cooling, is because the oceans are sucking it out. But commercial greenhouse gases typically pump up carbon dioxide to 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. You know why? Because under those ambient pressures, plant life proliferates. It gets, and there are many studies that have now been done showing that plants get healthier, more carbon dioxide. And the other thing is that the ability of carbon dioxide to capture, that's 15, 16, 17 micron long wave radiation that's passing through the window, it gets saturated and then it doesn't capture anymore. And at this point, it's near saturation. So what happens is the thermal consequences of carbon dioxide capture form a logarithmic scale, so that you can incrementally keep adding carbon dioxide up to a point, but the ability to capture heat diminishes exponentially until it finally just flattens out. And so the thermal warming aspect of it gets exhausted at roughly 200 to 300 parts per million, right? Yet the photosynthetic process really then when interestingly, right at about the threshold where the warming, the thermal capture capacity of carbon dioxide diminishes, the photosynthetic activity begins to activate. And it's taken 25 to 30 years to finally admit that the gross underestimation of forests around the planet from 30 years ago is due to the fact that nobody was taking account of the fact that forests of the world are being fed by the additional carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels. In fact, when you look at the old computer models, and I have these in my shows and stuff that I show, if you look at the old computer models, the estimates are like 25 to 30% less. And so what's happened from the 90s, once satellite surveys started, they began to realize, well, wait a second, our projections of the square miles of forest canopy were way off. There's way more forests than we were projecting, right? Well, what does that do to? Well, they started looking at all the variables, and one of the things they were acknowledging was, well, maybe those forests are consuming that extra carbon dioxide. Well, if you follow the literature, as I have, pretty much within the last decade, they've had to admit that it is primarily due to what they call carbon dioxide fertilization. So literally, we're burning fossil fuels. We've increased the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by roughly 120 to 130 parts per million, which is minuscule compared to the overall atmospheric composition. But we're fueling a greening of the earth, literally. Nobody's talking about that side of the dimension. Why? Well, because there's a whole agenda built around, the fear campaign of climate change, and now the term global warming was replaced by climate change. That was replaced by climate disruption. Now it's the climate crisis. And every single weather event now is being invoked as proof of the climate crisis. But what I show and say is that if you actually invest the time that the true believers refuse to do into what we now know about the history of climate on Earth, no, there's nothing that's going on unprecedented right now. So that's not really the concern. To me, two concerns. One, natural, which is that what I just showed you on that graph, something is driving this, right? Sun impacts, volcanism, or all of these combined, right? The other thing is man-made. And that is, we cannot continue to pursue a permanent war footing and competition for the resource of the admittedly limited resources of this planet without sooner or later something happening that leads to a catastrophe, a human-caused catastrophe, right? We could get into a whole discussion about what's going over there on in Ukraine and what the motives are behind that and the story behind it, which again, most people are completely oblivious to because mainstream media does not include any of that discussion in the narrative they're putting out. This oversimplified, mindless narrative that they're putting out, which completely falls apart under even the slightest scrutiny or historical context about what's going on in Ukraine, why the conflict started, and the idea that, look, we're pushing, and I pray about this. I mean, I pray that we're going to get one more reprieve. We got a reprieve during the Cold War. We came this close to nuclear war in October of 1962, right? You've heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
Well, you know what prevented that? What prevented the destruction of civilization by a thermonuclear war in October 1962? Diplomacy. See, what people don't understand is that leading up to that, the U.S. deployed Jupiter missiles in Italy and Turkey. These were intermediate range missiles that had the ability to blow up Moscow to reach Western Soviet Union at the time. They carried 1.44 megaton warheads. These are gigantic. destructive warheads. The attempt to deploy intermediate range missiles in Cuba was a response by the Soviet Union to our forward basing of these Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey. Luckily, we had a president at the time who was intelligent, who had a comprehensive understanding of the geopolitical situation at the time. He got together with back channels, talked with Khrushchev, and said, okay, tell you what, you turn your ships around that are carrying those missiles, and within 6 months, I promise, we will retrieve those Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey. Khrushchev trusted Kennedy, and Kennedy was as good to his word. So by April, now this is in October, by April, all of those forward-based nuclear missiles have been retrieved, right? That's how we avoided Armageddon back in 1962.
Randall, unfortunately, I have to change gears with you due to time.
I'm right there with you.
All right, but I need to talk about Disclosure Fest, Stairway to the Stars. You're going to be speaking that event. I believe it's in November, right?
Yes. But it's the second, third weekend. I should have those dates right in front of me.
What will you be disclosing? What kind of juicy stuff?
Well, good question. I'm still putting my program together. I don't have a whole lot of time. I am going to be doing a panel. I'm doing a presentation. I think it's only an hour. So I'm going to try to cram as much. I'll probably be talking, give us another month and a half, and we'll have additional data and information on plasma technology. So I certainly will be hoping to talk about that. I may even talk about the UFO thing a little bit. I've deliberately stayed away from that for reasons which I can get into, but I feel like maybe now is a good time to start that discussion. Plus the fact that some of the things that I've seen on the horizon with the plasma physics suggest to me that there may be a connection there. I certainly would be talking about catastrophism. Then I'm going to be on a panel discussion with Scott Walter and Tim Hogan, great guys. They're friends of mine. I love these guys. They're great scholars doing groundbreaking work. J.J. Hertak will be on that panel. I don't know him personally. I'm only marginally familiar with his work, so I'm looking forward to meeting him. So we're going to be doing a panel discussion. It looks like a great lineup of speakers. And so I will be there coming up in November. So people should go online, Disclosure Fest, to find out more about it. I will also mention very quickly and briefly that I've got yet another tour coming up the first day of the tour is actually going to be Halloween. So we're going to launch the tour. We've rented a great resort up on the plateau country of Eastern Tennessee. And we're going to explore some of the magic and mysteries of the hidden landscapes of Eastern Tennessee that people don't know about. And it's kind of like gives sort of an insight into the greater, environmental landscapes of global catastrophes. Because the final thing I'll say is we're talking global catastrophes. So they leave their fingerprints and their footprints in various ways all over the planet. So for 12,000 years, Jeff, there has been this great epic story engraved into the surface of the earth. And only within the last decade or two have we had the technological and scientific eyes and the intellectual understanding or intellectual framework to understand this great script that tells this story that's in the landscape. So my tours that I'm doing now are very much about teaching people how to read the script. And this will be, if people want to find out more about that, I think there's 4 or 5 seats left. I'd love to have a full house. It's going to be a lot of fun. We always have fun. There's going to be great food, and we'll be doing some outings. That first week in November, we'll have some of the leaf canopy will be gone so we can see what's been hiding under the trees. And it's some of the places we're going to be going is off the beaten path. So we got these 2 things coming up. The Cumberland tour, which you can find out by going to randallcarlson.com, and the Disclosure Fest. 2 exciting things that I hope people will engage in and know that this work, that this people like you and myself and a whole network of people around the planet are coming together to look at alternative paradigms of reality. And I think we're going to change history, Jeff.
Before we go real quick, you also have a YouTube channel and a podcast. What is the name of that?
Cosmographia. Cosmographia, you can put that in. We try to record every week. I do this with my colleague and friend Brad Young, and also my colleagues and friends Russ and Kyle Allen, who also do a podcast called Brothers of the Serpent. We were traveling together last week in Montana. I love these guys. We have so much fun together. But yeah, our problem lately has been all of us have been on the road so much that we haven't been able to record weekly. We're trying to get back to that. I'm going to launch a subsidiary podcast because it's much easier to get just myself together in front of the computer and record something than it is to get four of us together. But we're not going to, I may do Son of Cosmography. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet. It'll be mainly just me or maybe a guest. You and I could, if you wanted to come on and you and I have a conversation, that'd be wonderful. But in any case, that's Cosmographia, and there's 99 episodes up, and I cover in depth all of these things we've been talking about.
Well, Randall, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I'd love to have you back, and especially I'd love to talk to you about UFOs and get a little woo-woo with you next time.
Let's get woo. Hey, why not? Are you going to be at Disclosure Fest?
I will not.
Okay.
I wish I was, but I won't. I'm not planning on it.
Okay, well, next time I'm crossing Texas, maybe I can swing by San Antonio.
I hope you do.
Drop in and we have dinner or something.
That would be amazing.
If you ever get up this way, definitely look me up. I own a little piece of an interest in a restaurant I designed and built a few years ago that turned out to be wildly successful.
That's
so
awesome.
If you come up here, I'll treat you to dinner there. Are you a vegetarian by any chance?
No.
Okay. Well, they make the best Cuban I've ever had, best Nashville hot chicken I've ever had, plus a whole lot of other things.
Sounds.
And we could spend a little time in this. So if you ever showed up, see, I've got this amazing conference table I've built back here.
Yeah, I see that.
And I have yet to record a single conference around it. But that's the plan, is to get some guests in here. I've got a whole gantry above. You can't see it. It's on the ceiling with the lights, the microphones, everything. So I'm ready to go and start interviewing guests. So, hey, if you're ever up this way, we'll have dinner and then we can have a great conversation sitting around the octagon table there.
That would be awesome. I don't know if you like to go woo, but I've had a great guest right there in Atlanta. Two great guests that record UFOs consistently. There's a guy named John Martin that's, besides being a UFO enthusiast, is a professional classical guitarist and has played maybe around the world and even played for Jimmy Carter and kind of befriended Jimmy Carter. And then there's a guy named Dr. Courtney Brown over at Emory.
I've definitely heard of and know of Courtney Brown.
Right. He's a local for you.
Well, I should talk to these guys. And hey, look, I am not adverse to getting a little woo. There's a place for woo.
Yeah.
That's sometimes just, I don't know, I kind of draw the line at woo woo.
Right.
Say, we can go woo. Let's not go beyond woo woo, because now we're getting into some questionable territory.
Right.
But yeah, you got to be open-minded, right?
Right. I totally agree.
Well, you know what, Jeff, I really enjoyed this conversation. I did most of the talking.
Well, that's okay. You're the expert. I'm here just to extract information from you.
You're here to goad me on.
Right.
Says, okay. Well, I've enjoyed it very much.
Me too.
And would be happy to do this again.
Thank you so much.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Randall. Have a great rest of your evening, and God bless you, and good evening.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. So long.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.